Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you guys are at. I hope you're having a fantastic day. It's SoulSaint here, and I wanted to talk to you guys about something that's kind of never really touched upon too greatly. You hear like some nuance about some things here and there, but like overall, the experience of like a player and their progression and how it's dictated by some elements in the game, and in particular, one area that I think a lot of people are either very aware of, or they're subliminally aware of, or they're not aware of at all in terms of its value, is the Great Hall. I wanted to do a little bit of a breakdown and kind of give you guys perspective, and that's pretty much what I'm aiming for here in terms of like value and like where your numbers and whatnot come from. And I'm just going to go ahead and kind of explain this now. A lot of times I've seen in videos, like for example, the Monster Hunter video that had to do with Rathalos and how we built him, and it's like, okay, the gear's okay, and this, that, and the other. I'm speaking from the perspective of where I should be at on my account compared to where I am. And that's where that's normally coming from. And the reason why I would say that is based on the amount of gear I can acquire, or the type of gear I can acquire, and the stats that I can build a champion around, and the expectations I would have in terms of those numbers, right? So I know this is all kind of talking about like builds and this, that, and the other, but like Great Hall and its value, I'm going to kind of try to see if I can show you in a summary of words. Let's look at a champion that is defensive by nature, but is also a nuker. One of my originals, he's actually got outdated gear, just to give you context, right? So like in terms of speeds, it's not all that. But I want to give you an idea, and I want you to look around like two particular areas. For a nuker, once you're able to hit 100% crit rate, it's their primary stat and crit damage, right? Just to give you like a quick TLDR summary of what like a nuker build is supposed to look like. So the objective is a decent amount of speed with 100% crit rate, and then as much crit damage and their primary stat as you can get, right? So whatever that value is, it's a healthy balance between the two, right? So I have an okay amount of crit damage here with a decent amount of defense. Now it's not top of the line. I think top of the line can get you north of like maybe 8K. Something around those lines, but it's not too bad, right? Just to give you context. I want to show you in the same breath, though, someone like Mishinaki, who, for example, it's on the flip side. I actually have a lot of crit damage, but not as much defense. Now, the reason why I'm showing you those two champions in example for my account is this. The story speaks for itself, or the stats speak for themselves. If you look at my Ragash, although he's due for a rebuild, and my Mishinaki, who recently was built, but you can kind of see where the deficiency lies at, it really does speak volumes, whereas like my Ragash, who is Spirit Affinity, is actually fully decked out from a affinity bonus standpoint, where he has like the full level 10 for crit damage and the full level 10 for defense percent, right? Whereas like my Mishinaki has pretty much the same thing outside of the defense being lacking in that regard, right? So the difference maker between the two in terms of like the stat values, imagine what it would be like if a build was fully nurtured to the point where we could do a full, like if you had your affinity bonuses fully decked out, right? Now, I'm also going to flip it on you guys and talk about the area bonuses and how that looks once you add that in complement to the build that you have already with affinity bonuses. But to really kind of break it down in terms of like perspective and value, one thing that I did notice is that my builds for certain champions are really, really good, or some of them are really, really lackluster, right? I'll go back into Force, which is what my weakest affinity in terms of champion pool. I didn't have as many as I was coming up, and the little bit I did have was only designed around areas where I cared, which was like accuracy for like Geomancer, for example, when I was using him in Clan Boss or in his new place in Iron Twins, right? Like that's all that's the most tedious or the most troublesome stat to get. Once that, I just needed him to hit the right speeds, and then he did what he did, right? Well, as a byproduct of that, it kind of speaks for itself, whereas like my champion pool is starting to expand, and now I have a little bit of magic, I have a little bit of spirit, I have a little bit of force, and I have a little bit of void, right? Like it's now expanding, right? And as a byproduct of that, I noticed that some areas where I'm building nukers, like I particularly have a very high placement of Xena in PvP, not only live arena, but in tag team and classic, where she's really good as a niche pick or a counter pick against meta champions, right? Like, for example, your Siffys, your Duchesses who are going fast, right? She's able to cut in as a byproduct of them doing what they're known to do well with, right? Like their buffing situation, right? But she's a Force champion, and she doesn't have the highest of stats. Now, mind you, I put her in an okay build. She's not actually one of my top choices for nukers, even though I do respect her as one of those capable champions. But even then, her damage stats kind of speak for themselves, right? I have an average around like 6K, 255, maybe a little bit higher in the grand scheme of things. But if you were taking consideration what you can get from a maximum stat Great Hall bonus, the build would actually evolve. So like right now I have 2% that I'm adding from an area or affinity bonus, whereas I could add another 23% on top of that. So what would that look like if I were to take her build and add that additional percentage on top of that? So she's currently around 261. You add that 23, like I said, now it's 70, 80. Now that's starting to look like a more comparable build to what would be in line with maybe like your in-game players. Normally north of like 300% is pretty much when you're starting to tell what like an account has really matured enough to a point where they're standing out. The same thing is also true from like a damage standpoint. Now, the stat blow from blessings is also another thing we can kind of talk about, which will be a champion specific. It's not Great Hall specific bonus, but it does fluctuate a little bit more now that we have access to basically all stats from blessings, and the bloat's going to go a little bit higher, right? But with that being said, like look at attack right now for my champion. She's at 6K, and I'm only using this as a reference. Like it's only reference point. Some of my pieces are oiled decently enough. They're not like crazy high. I did get some good rolls in some areas where like it's applicable, and there's some that are not even fully decked out, right? Like I'm not finished with her build. Like she's only gotten some key areas that are of importance to me that she's still got room for improvement, right? Even with her current gear, let alone another rebuild if I were to do so, right? So with that being said though, add into the measure of what attack percent could do for a build, right? In that same mark, I'm missing out on 18% in addition to what I already have. So the difference between that and maybe a more developed, unfortunately, I don't have any of my attack that are fully developed there. And we're going to talk about what would be valuable in terms of focuses and areas of the game where you're progressing. I'll get to that in just a moment. But I just want to kind of give you a visual understanding of why farming your Great Hall in general is very, very important. Let's take a look at someone that's a little bit more developed. I normally don't show this, but I'm going to go ahead and do this now. I have my Georgette built for Live Arena, and he's actually one of my go-to nukers. This is pretty much my attack percent and my crit damage percent are decked out. There's not much more I can get from a Great Hall bonus, from an affinity bonus. This is it, right? At this point, it's going to be Empowerment, Faction Guardians, and of course, the gear itself. Even then, this build is technically supposed to be a little bit faster. Glyphing and all that's going to be a thing. And of course, same thing with attack glyphing and all that other extra amenities that I can provide to the build. But I'm already sitting over 8K. I'm already over 300% crit damage. And I'm in a damage build like Savage, for example, coupled with speed. It's a really good build. This build, outside of maybe the banner, as you can see, is pretty much kind of primed as best as I can make it as of right now. It's really good. It's not a bad build. I think that like ideally I'd want to get more stats. I would even be willing to compromise a little bit of the damage for what I do with him in areas like Live Arena, where speed is a lot more relevant, so I probably will end up picking up speed, maybe drop a little bit of the crit damage, a little bit of the attack, if that's what I need to do to compromise to get higher speeds, but I want to bring that up a notch, right? But the goal is to just maintain his damage and bring my speeds up as efficiently as I can be, and to kind of show you that in premise of like where the stats are at, you can kind of see it. I'll show you one where it's like halfway again in terms of attack. I got my crit damage fully decked out, but my attack percent is not decked out from a Spirit Affinity standpoint, so this is actually a good reference point. Really good crit damage. I did compromise a little bit of his stats. I normally would be able to get him closer towards like the 300% range, and I would say on average with someone like Sun Wukong, who I did put my foot into, it was around like 7.5, maybe even 8K. I was also scratching around, but I did compromise his build because one, I wanted to add a little bit of accuracy, and also I wanted to pick up his speed a little bit more too as well. The more active he is, in particular for like Hydra content, was kind of the area that I wanted to make value out of. Now, with that being said, I'm going to show you why you're also going to want to do Live Arena and area bonuses. Look at what I just did. I added Hydra bonuses to the factor because that's an area I do use some Wukong in, and look at how much more different that build looks now. I'm hitting high accuracy requirements. I got a decent amount of resistance, which I wasn't trying to do, but it kind of came naturally. And the crit damage is there, right? We have those numbers. We found what we were looking for. And then on top of that too, I actually hit higher speeds, which is phenomenal. That is actually a game changer aspect behind area bonuses, if not the most important, if you want my opinion. And then I get a little extra 20%, which isn't including the set bonus I'm getting from Cruelty and Savage. So technically, put your nerd glasses on, I'm actually getting more than 25%. So add the 20 from the area bonus, 25%, and then the extra 5%. So 30 plus the 20 is what? 60% ignored, right? Which is why you can start seeing the stat values in terms of damage output really scale up, and that's not even including masteries, which are chance procs, but that's besides the point. Some of the big hits that I'm hitting is because of those contributing factors, right? So hopefully you can kind of see why investing to your Great Hall is important. Now I want to break it down for you guys at a much more microscopic level. what area should you focus on with? I think a general consensus for a lot of players when they first start out the game is accuracy is one of those initial stat requirements that are hard to acquire because you're trying to build a foundation off of and you don't really have anything anywhere, right? So when you're trying to go in one stat, all the other stats, like early game, this is very, very early when you first start in the game, all your other stats are going to pale in comparison when you're trying to push one stat. Then your gear is going to develop to a point where maybe you can do two stats. But then there's always that third stat that you need, or maybe that fourth stat you need that's kind of compromised as a byproduct of pushing these other two stats, right? Well, what we notice is that a lot of the characters that we use when we first start off in the game are very accuracy dependent. So think about your starter champions, KO as a free-to-play champion. For those that were around when RTAC was a daily login champion, accuracy dependent, you know? All these champions were contingent upon being able to land debuffs in order to be able to apply the value that they bring as a champion, and as such, a lot of people would recommend that accuracy be a high priority focus. But as you progress in the game, and this is still valuable to this day, I normally recommend that if you have no idea where you're going, a good starting point would be to get at least 3 affinities based on your champion pool, up to 5, and that's for a challenge that you would get, and that's for books and to help progress your account a little bit more in terms of like resources. But then you're going to do quality over quantity. So you notice how I have not that many like stats that are developed in terms of 7s. I'm starting to do that now, but that's only because of where I'm at, and you can do that after you get to a certain point in the game. But initially, when I was progressing in my early, mid, and even late game phases, I was prioritizing particular stats, getting the most that I can out of it, because here's why. When you invest in terms of the quality of a build, 5 stats doesn't really change a piece. 20 stats in a particular might, 50 should, 80 will. And that's what I mean, like in terms of like the stat value. Look at it like this. 80 accuracy when it's fully finished out could be the difference between you needing to have a defensive banner or a accuracy chest to now you can go attack percent chest for like your DPS champions. Now, there are pieces in the game that allow you to focus on accuracy as a primary stat. I'll use this as a reference point. Accuracy as a primary stat, and it'll give you 96. Well, what's the difference between 90 and 86? 80 and 96? Well, it's 16, right? 16 being the difference, you can glyph that. Literally, it's a matter of glyphing in the sense of an accuracy. So like +6, I'm going to disappear here for a second. A tier 6 could be 16. Or if you're early progressing, maybe 5 or 3% or precision glyphs could give you 5 at the highest, and that could be 15 right there. You're pretty much close to closing that gap of that 16 that you were missing out on, right? So in the grand scheme of things, when it comes to like the difference maker, that is literally what separates you having to use 2 accuracy primary stated items, whether it's your accuracy banner and your accuracy chest, to now I only have accuracy as my banner, but now I can go a damage build for my chest, and that scales up your efficiency. Now remember how we're talking about we're adding an extra stat to worry about, right? Because you're able to lean on your affinity bonus, that automatically opens the door for your builds from a damage perspective to go up. Then from there, if we're looking in the same affinity, a champion that we're talking about damage, right? I'll give an example using Fane as your go-to for clan boss. It's a really good champion. You just got your unkillable online, and you want to use Fane as your damage dealer. She's really good for clan boss because she has good damage output, but she also brings to the table really good debuffs, right? Decreased defense and weaken are great. Poison are great. And I'm not going to go down the line further into that, but you need accuracy to land those first and foremost. So now you got that done, right? Well, now you can start expanding upon that. And this is where you have to take a conscious evaluation of your account and where your focus is at. All right, I'm still trying to improve my key damage so that I can get more resources from clan boss. All right, well, in that case, if Fane, as the example here, is being your champion, maybe crit damage would be the best attribute to go for. Now, I also note that like her primary stat is attack, but you notice how I kind of lean towards crit damage more? The reason why I say that is this. When you look at it from a damage dealer perspective, hitting a primary stat will help out all champions that are based off of that stat. Like attack type champions will benefit from attack type modifiers, right? HP champions will benefit from HP modifiers. Defensive champions will benefit from defensive modifiers. Whereas crit damage will benefit all of them. So in that particular case, I always would value, if you're looking from a damage output, crit damage would be your first point versus the primary stat, the second stat, the alternative, the balance behind it, right? And yes, it's going to lopside your builds a little bit in terms of your value, but look at what you get from a primary stat value. Now, the argument goes in terms of this, right? Crit damage is probably ideally one of the best stats you're going to get from a damage build for your gloves. But from your chest, it's always going to be that primary stat, right? The same is also true, though, that you can technically get a primary stat value if you're looking at it. Now, I don't normally recommend it, but you could technically get a primary stat value also in the gloves, right? So you can double dip into 2 areas to get a primary stat value, whereas when you're looking for crit damage as a whole, it's only 1, right? Outside of that, it's all going to be substats laced across the board outside of maybe your necklace or your amulet, right? And in this particular case, I view that because you're able to benefit multiple type champions, crit damage is a much more valuable standpoint from a damage dealer perspective. Now, keep in mind, though, if your gear has kind of gotten to a point where, like, all right, well, I kind of get my damage where I need to, survivability is more of a concern. Then, based on the evaluation of your account and the type of champions you have in those affinities, so, like, for me, I was very spirit heavy, and then it also became a lot more void heavy, as you could tell with my Great Hall. I decided to do areas that would benefit my champions in those particular areas. Case in point, my HP and defense for void is maxed out. I'll disappear so you can see it. Very, very, they're maxed out. And then, of course, my spirit, for example, my Duchess, who carried me in a lot in this game, were 2 champions that the 2 affinities I benefited tremendously from. Also, case in point, you see how I'm kind of also dipping a little bit more still into spirit. It still is based off of my focuses of what I have on my game and what I'm using, right? What areas do I need to improve into to be able to effectively do what I do? And that's where you see like these areas that I'm kind of dipping into now. Even though it's a little bit more spread, there's still some focus behind it, right? Case in point, my Artec is still an Ice Golem, giving him some more HP and defensive stats, makes it a little bit easier for his build so that I can balance it in other areas. Like right now, his speed's a little bit lackluster, which is where that will be, the key point, right? You see like how I'm building in areas that are of benefit to comps that I'm using, right? The same is also true in terms of like the value of what you're trying to build in towards. Artec is not a damage dealing builder. This was designed when I was building it up in terms of crit damage was for Raza, Varg, and Mishinaki, who were in my clan boss at the time, and then they end up intrinsically being used everywhere else as a byproduct of their just efficiency, right? I built into accuracy and crit damage to make them more effective, right? The same is also true for Artec, though, where he is benefiting now, like he benefits from having accuracy and a little bit of resistance, but also his defense and HP, which is what he scales off of, being built up as well. So you kind of see like the value there. I'm not dipping my points into attack to benefit Artec. I'm benefiting in the points that are applicable to him. But since he's also in a utility build, so his build is designed to sustain and survive, and in order for him to survive, he needs to be able to resist debuffs that would prohibit him from doing that, as well as the stats that keep him alive. Then, on the output of where his damage comes from, accuracy is a valuable standpoint because all I need is the burns and the efficiency to activate them, right? So, placing them is the most important part where accuracy comes into play. So, it really does depend on where your account is at and what you're building to kind of effectively give you the ideology of where you're going to put your points towards. I normally recommend that at a starting point, what impacts a build the most is definitely going to be accuracy, but especially for champions you're trying to build into accuracy. And then from there, it's going to be adding on the extra elements that they need to be able to be effective. So in this case point, if we were talking back to the example of Feign, now that I'm done with crit damage, I need a little bit more output from where I'm trying to optimize that a little bit more. I would lean towards attack, right? Now, I'm not using Feign in this, in the reality outside of the example, but it is important to note that, like, depending on where you're focusing at, if you're trying to complete something, until you hit that completion, where else can you bring your stats towards? Well, now we can flip it onto the other side. Now we're talking about specific dungeons, right? I was talking about Artec. Well, I finally was able to hit my resistance, and I'm able to hit my accuracy modifiers, so, like, hitting these right here would be a bit redundant, right? It would only be quality of life at that point. Whereas his speed could be a little bit better. So I also view, in my personal perspective, that area bonus-wise, speed is probably by far one of the biggest metric points between you being able to do stage 1 of hard spider to doing stage 10 of spider, as an example. Case in point, I did points in speed in both dragon and spider when I was progging them, primarily to get me to the point where I was able to effectively hit the speeds I needed to hit, and then I spread into areas where I needed extra damage, or I needed extra attack, or if I needed more survivability with HP, for example. And that's what we ended up doing. Now, eventually, this is all going to get spread, so no matter where you put it at, it's good. But I would do things in a way that would benefit your account to effectively being able to hit a certain objective, right? So, for me, in my example, I was trying to get to a point where I could do stage 10 consistently. Well, I needed to hit that speed metric first, so I put speed in. I started seeing that, like, once I hit level 5, I was like, okay, I'm starting to hit these numbers a little bit more consistently, but my damage is starting to kind of take a little bit of a hit from it. What I could do is I could add more speed. There's nothing wrong there because the less speed dependent you are, the better you can focus on other stats. But then I could also add to those stats themselves as well, where it's like they're a little bit lackluster. So I decided, let me spread a little bit to see how it felt. And it gave me roughly exactly what I was expecting as it came along. This was kind of good, but then the other two were kind of lackluster. I brought them up to a point where they were decent enough, and the full total build gave me what I was looking for. You could do that. I strongly recommend a quality over quantity approach. I did this as an experiment, so learn from my mistake, but more so my experience in this matter. I valued a lot more once I had full quality done on each area, and I'll give you a perfect example on the flip side. I noticed a significant difference once I started hitting 8, 9, and 10 respectively for Hydra builds. And then the same is also true for like ignore percent and crit damage. I noticed specifically once I hit 6 and 7, I started to tell like, okay, my boys are starting to hit now. And then once I hit 10 and I started working on crit damage, my boys are starting to really hit now. It's really good. Like, it's getting to that point where that efficiency starts to come up after the consistency was established, right? Now, I will say this too as well, if we're going to talk about like damage as a focus. The argument between crit damage and ignore percent defense is always going to be one that's going to be a toss-up between players. One way that you can kind of identify whether or not one is more valuable than the other is you look at the source of what you're fighting. I'm gonna actually pull something up here as an example for you guys to kind of refer to as a reference point. I use the Hell Hades Stages tool when it comes to identifying areas or like requirements, like stat requirements to effectively be able to place debuffs or to resist them if I'm trying to mitigate it. And I'll just use Hydra as an example here since we're talking about it. I'm trying to make sure I top chest Hydra, get good points for Clash, Brutal, the whole 9 yards, right? So I look at like, okay, if we're talking about damage, ignore percent defense is literally what it's defined as. You're trying to ignore a portion of the champion or a boss that you're fighting's defense to be able to do more damage, right? And then of course your damage is going to scale off of your crit damage and your modifier once full crit rate has been established, or you hit your 100% cap. Those that like cold hearts and whatnot, those are the exceptions to the rules. We're not talking about them for the breakdown of this example. In the same sense though, when you look at a particular boss, like for example, if I'm trying to crack open the Decay Head, 6.2k defense is a lot, right? Let's look at one of the more tankier champions, 11 for Head of Suffering, which is the most tankiest boss in the Hydra set, is 11k. That's a lot of defense to work off of. So ignore percent defense will do you very well. Imagine what we were talking about when I was showing you my Wukong build as an example. I'm not even going to talk about what he gets intrinsically with his 50% on his A2. I'm just going to say his A3, for example, which doesn't have ignore percent defense modifiers added to it, right? I want to be able to do as much damage as I can to it, and I have already established with my set bonuses, I got 30% of that ignored. Well, if I add the other bit of area bonuses from Hydra, I get an additional 20. That adds up to 50% right there, 30 plus 20, right? Now, take this and divide it into half. That's what 50% of that goes away, right? Now, it looks like he's a little bit more on par with like your average damage, your average heads for Hydra. Now, that's a little bit more easier to get some output from her, right? So, the value of ignore percent defense goes up higher the more defense that a boss has. On the flip side, too, though, that if you're going against like a champion, or we'll even break it down to something a little bit more nuanced. Like, at the hardest stage for Nightmare, for Clan Boss, this guy has 847 defense. You divide that in half, you're only getting 400 out of that. Whereas, like, you divide the half of the Suffering Head at Nightmare, that's 5,000. There's a big difference there, right? Well, if we're looking at that case, then the value of ignore percent defense goes down tremendously, whereas crit damage still gains its relevance. At that point, if we're talking about Clan Boss as an example for Demon Lord, I'd recommend that you'd go crit damage first and then ignore percent defense later. I would even argue that because of how low the defense is by nature, I would even say crit damage into primary stat value, like attack percent or HP percent or defense percent, depending on what champions you're using, would be more valuable than ignore percent defense, right? Whereas for like Hydra again, because their defense is so astronomically high, you could probably get value out of going ignore percent defense first and then crit damage afterwards, because that'll benefit all types, attack, HP, and defense type champions, instead of just going their primary stat value. So when you look at my Great Hall as a value point, that's my free to play, sorry, you'll see that I did exactly what I told you guys. I did my speed first, and then I went ignore percent first, and then I went crit damage afterwards. Now that I'm actually getting there, I'm tuning up a little bit more. This is kind of more just like a visual quality of life. I was already 5 or 6 here to kind of help hit This is around the time frame when I acquired Krisk. I wanted him to be my mischief tank, and rightfully so, with the efforts that we did to our Great Hall on bonus, on affinity bonus as well as area bonus. He was able to hit really good metrics for hitting those stat values, those stat challenges, those stat requirements we needed to hit. So he was able to effectively do that, right? But now it's gotten to a point now where if I want to pump out more damage, resistance isn't going to help me. Accuracy might give me a little bit more playroom because it's less demanding in a stat value, and I actually might see that through a little bit. But then after that, it's going to be the primary stat values, right? Eventually, it's all going to be done, but like, what is your intent behind giving the stat bonus to your account? And that really is going to be defined of, do I need more damage? Do I need more survivability? And that'll really kind of set the tone. Now, I will give you an argument that like champions like Mishinaki also benefit from that defensive standpoint and that HP standpoint. So I honestly would lean towards those first, because not only are you getting the damage output from those defensive champions or the HP-based champions, but you're also adding to survivability. Those are two stat values that benefit towards survival, right? So that's probably how I would lean towards it when it comes to like building up your Great Hall from an area bonus, depending on the fight you're looking at. You know, you're looking to incorporate those elements that are going to benefit you in that objective, right? Now, let's flip it. We're talking about damage again, or we're talking about efficiency of being able to beat this. The way I have my spider team designed is that the boss should never hit me. Neither should the spiderlings, right? So, like, my build concept, and this is where, like, the concept of building or compositions are going to kind of play a little bit of a caveat into this, is... yeah, I could build it up so that they can survive a hit in the event he does keep going, but the way my team is built is that he's not going to do damage to me in the first place, right? So my focus is this. I need the output to be there. I need him to be able to do that much damage that I need him to hit, and then from there, we should be able to get out of here. That's basically it, right? So building into a defensive nature or with utility in mind where that doesn't benefit me, it serves no purpose to benefit your account. That is something you can invest in down the road as a quality of life measure, but not right now as an immediate focus for me. If I wanted to make sure that I get those full 10%, so I don't know if you noticed, but the boss, when I hit him with my first G-Nut, didn't do the full 1.479 mil per hit, which means I wasn't hitting my crit cap. It would not benefit me to put resistance or accuracy or even HP % on my spider team for G-Nut to thrive. If anything, it'd be better to do my crit damage, ignore %, and then of course defense % to give him that full measure of damage that he needs to do to be able to fully pack a punch and get that full 10%. Now, I could also build the comp around. I was a little lazy with my build, so don't judge me, but I could probably build my Lydia to be faster than the G-Nuts so that they can do decrease defense and weaken first, and then from there, they'll probably have that efficiency. So, you know, moot point. I'm just kind of looking at an individual character just as a point of reference, right? So, like, play in mind what you're looking to do with your comp whenever you're making your team builds as well. If you're trying to be faster, then, of course, speed benefits you. If you're trying to be more survival, then HP and defense will scale up better for you. Maybe some resistance and accuracy, depending on what you need in your build to sustain through the battle of attrition. But after that, it's going to be a component about how do you want to build your team, and then the stats that you're going to need to be able to accomplish that should be your focus. And then you could take a tip from me in terms of like pushing it to its maximum so that you don't have to worry about that status much, or you could play the factor of I got to where I am efficient enough or sufficient enough to be able to do what I need to do. Now I can lace in other stats to get where I need to be at. I will be honest with you, quality over quantity still reigns supreme for me across the board. I'm at the point now where I've beaten all the content in the game outside of maybe Soul Cross, which area bonuses are going to help out with there naturally. So I'm kind of the proponent that I can make this a little bit prettier so that you guys don't have to be like, look at that 0, you know what I mean? Like, we don't want to see that 0. And I get it. I'm working on it, as you can obviously see. I mean, we just hit reset already, and I'm already up 129. We're working on it. We do like a Great Hall farming session at Plat Reset, and we try to really grind out as much as we can with our fellow clannies, and we grow our account that way, right? So I'll try to bring all these up to 7, and then eventually I'll do some particular focused 10s, and then we'll bring everything up to 10, and then the account's at this point where it's hit that peak potential, right? But I hope you guys get like an idea of like how well it can establish your account. And I'll just show you another thing for reference too as well. I'm not trying to brag here or anything around those lines. I don't have Blessing on Krisk, just to give you like a measure of like where base Krisk is at. But I was able to push my gear to a point where I was able to get him to 289. I actually wouldn't mind him having more speeds on top of that, but the boss fights in Hydra can be pretty fast in the Nightmare territory. Look at what I'm able to get. 20 extra speed is tremendous in the value of my build because now it puts me to a point where maybe I'm getting ahead with decreased speed and increased speed in play. Maybe I'm able to lap the bosses, and that could be the thing that opens the door for me to be able to perma control the fight. And then from there, I can just inject as much damage as I want to in there, right? And being able to have those area bonuses play a factor into my build just further amplifies my efficiency and consistency, for that matter. And that's something that I want to really kind of give you guys value in terms of like how important it is to hunker down. And even if it's something that you don't care for a focus, you know, it could be something that you could look at as an opportunity to improve your experience. So with that being said, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. I look forward to seeing your Great Hall grow just as mine is. And with that being said, let me know where you're at. What level are you at in your Great Hall? Like, comment, subscribe, and let me know what you got going on over there. And always, as always, always remember, stay ascended.